Welcome back. How's the sound? Is it okay? Great, good. So the first part I talked about this sense of lack and the problem. So what can we say about the solution? And I think Buddhism, not only Buddhism, but I think Buddhism is especially good at offering us a solution to this fundamental problem because it addresses the delusion of a separate self, right? It makes sense. If the sense of lack is the shadow of a sense of self, if we can see through the delusion, let go of that delusion of a separate self, then at the same time we're letting go of the foundation of the sense of lack, right? So let me just unpack that a little bit. I started out by saying that the sense of self is a psychological and social construct made up of certain, mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting and reacting and so forth. And Buddhism actually talks about this. There's the 5 khandha or 5 skandhas where basically it deconstructs the sense of self. And I think Buddhism is quite clear. It's not deconstructing the self. It's deconstructing the sense of self. There's nothing to get rid of. It's simply a kind of illusion or delusion that we need to sort of see through. And none of that is to deny the fact that we also need the sense of self in order to function in daily life. So it's not about completely getting rid of it, but it's sort of, as it were, understanding how it works, being able to experience in different ways without getting stuck in one way or the other. So if the sense of self is composed of these habitual ways of thinking, these patterns of behavior, I think we can understand how meditation is working, right? Because when we're meditating, what's going on? Well, these ways of thinking and feeling rise to the mind, but if the meditation is going well, we don't jump up and immediately try to satisfy or act on them, but we let them go, right? And if the sense of self is composed of these habitual ways of thinking, feeling, so forth, the act of learning not to identify, letting them go, is in a way how the sense of self is deconstructing. And it's not that we are deconstructing the sense of self, but the sense of self is deconstructing the we, or the me, you see. Dogen Zenji, the great 13th century Japanese Zen master, summarized this process the best I know in his Genjo Koan, where he says, and again, I'm sure this is something most of you are familiar with. He says, quote, right, to study the self, to study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self, right? Now, study here is not going to university, but it means sort of inquire into, right? So to study the Buddha Dharma, the teaching, the Dharma, is basically, it's all about learning something about the sense of self. To study the self is to, am I getting confused? Let me start all over again. Okay. To study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to realize your intimacy with the 10,000 things, right? Yeah. So what's he describing there? He's describing the process of letting go of the sense of self. And it's not something that we can do directly. It's not as though the self can directly forget the self. It's not an active process in that way. That's the point of the meditation. It's something that happens indirectly in the process of learning not to identify with all of the thought processes, etc., that are going on in our minds. And what we call kensho in Zen would be like a first glimpse or a first taste when we're actually able to, something happens as a result. And again, it's not a cause and effect relationship in the sense that we don't make it happen, but if we meditate especially, then something can happen. And there's this moment of forgetting ourselves and experiencing the world in a non-dual way, where the whole illusion of separation, the idea that there's a me inside and you and the rest of the world is outside, that illusion collapses. Yeah. I love the way that Chogyam Trungpa described it, where he said, enlightenment is like falling out of an airplane. You know this? The bad news is there's no parachute. The good news is there's no ground. Right? Another description is by, actually he's not a Buddhist, Nisargadatta. He's a kind of Neo-Vedantin teacher in India. I guess a kind of next generation from Ramana Maharshi, for those of you who are familiar with that. Actually, he put it better than anyone I know when he said, quote, when I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows, right? Wisdom and love, or as we more often say in Buddhism, wisdom and compassion, right? The two pillars of the path, really. And I love the way that he shows the relationship between them, right? To have this experience of wisdom, this realization, how does one embody that, right? To realize that I'm not in here, but I'm one manifestation of all of this. And there's this wonderful kind of turning around of the meaning of one's life. Because as long as we have these sense of lack, regardless of the particular kind of lack projects we may get caught up in, it's this sense of, it's about me, right? It's like, I've got to focus on me. It's my problem. And so there's a certain self-preoccupation leading perhaps to a kind of narcissism at an extreme, this trying to bolster or whatever, but self-preoccupation. And then the experience that Nisargadatta is talking about is, there's, sometimes in the literature it's described as a paravriti, a turning around. So just as there's the experience of, I'm not in here looking out through my eyes at you, but I'm all of this sort of taking form here. What does that mean? What's the consequence for the meaning of one's life? And I think this is what naturally leads to what we call the Bodhisattva path. Right? The Bodhisattva path is not a sacrifice, as it's sometimes portrayed in the literature. The Bodhisattva, I'm not going to enter nirvana until everyone else enters nirvana first. No, it's not that way. It's more, wow, I don't have to be preoccupied with these lack projects. And so what do I want to do with my life? How do I want to live in a way that expresses this realization of non-duality, of non-separation? And I think it naturally involves then a kind of, what can I do to make this world better for everyone? Because, my well-being, if we want to talk in those terms, is not separate from the well-being of you or the well-being of other people. Hugely important realization that can lead to sort of restructuring how one wants to live. Right? So it seems to me this is how we can understand the Buddhist path addressing and at its best resolving the kind of fundamental problem that people otherwise tend to get so caught up in, this sense of lack. And I suppose we could sort of talk more about this, but I think this might be a good time to stop. I know that there's a number of questions. Maybe we can open things up for discussion. Maybe I've talked enough or more than enough. I know we had an initial question. Okay.
And if you do have a question, raise up your hand.
Sure.
And I will come and bring the microphone to you, because we have these people online that would also like to know your question.
And people online may have questions too, if we have a way
That's right. And
to,
online folks, put the question in the chat box.
No, have them raise their hand, because then I'll see it.
Okay, so our tech host Sam is asking online participants with questions to use the raise your hand function, which you'll find on the bottom menu bar. And if you talk in the microphone, notice how it looks like I'm going to lick a ice cream cone. That's a good position so we can hear you very well.
that's good.
I'm interested in how you see the lack project developing in human beings from infancy. I have two twin granddaughters who are about to turn 3. And so I've been monitoring the development of the lack project in them. They have, of course, different personalities, and yet, there they are. Same parents, they look alike. They kind of have different ways in which they express what they think they lack and how they develop their separate selves. So your thoughts would be welcome.
They would be even more welcome if I knew more about child psychology, But actually, a comment that was made to me during the break, I think is very relevant here about how at an early stage, it's very much about attention. Remember what I said earlier, how the sense of self is a psychological, social construct that we learn to see ourselves as others see us. And I think this gets at the heart of why it is we are so preoccupied with what other people think about us. Because in a sense, from the beginning, our sense of self is dependent on that. And so I think one way that it tends to come out very young is the children's need for attention from the caregiver. And if they don't give it, the kind of problem that can result. We talk about the need for love, that young children need love, but we can also understand it from this angle, that the love and the attention are sort of two aspects of the same thing that are needed if they're going to develop in a healthy way. And maybe you can follow up? Yes, please. We were talking during the break about this.
I am really taken with your framing of this as a lack project. That just resonated so strongly for me. And my personal story was, I was high enough to be like eyeball height to doorknobs. So I don't know what that is, 4, 5 years old. I'm the oldest of 4 in my family. And looking back through this now, I wonder if attachment theory psychology would have anything to say about what happens at that age. For me, what happened was I was adored by my parents, and I relished that attention, and that collapsed when they would invite guests over to the house, because all of a sudden they'd turn their attention to the guest and not to me anymore. And so I discovered all sorts of behaviors that were really embarrassing to my parents that pulled their attention away from the guests back onto me so that I wouldn't feel invisible, and that I wasn't, now in hindsight I know I was going to be invisible and I was going to die. If they didn't notice me, I would cease to exist. And I still do that today, and I'm only 65. But now I have some understanding of it, thanks to your lensing of this as a lack project. Thank you so much.
Sounds like you were really obnoxious.
I learned how to do things like accidentally lose my balance and crash into, a freestanding metal cabinet that would make a lot of racket, or fake fainting and falling over face first onto the floor. I'm only 4 or 5 years old, so there was no injury. My parents were terrified, and that interrupted their visit, and I got the attention that I was lacking. Yeah, fascinating.
I think we often continue to play that game in some way, but we're a little bit less obnoxious as we grow up, or a little bit less obvious maybe. And speaking of attention and lack projects, all what I've just presented today is explored in greater detail in 2 of the books, which if you will all buy will make me relatively wealthy and famous. There's the book Lack and Transcendence, and then there's a more popular version called Money, Sex, War, Karma, which is basically elaborating what I've been talking about, if people want to follow up.
Okay, we'll have one more here from in person, and then we'll go to our next question after that, just so folks get ready. To someone online.
So I guess my question for you goes back to all the work that you've done around climate change and the Dharma. So I'm just curious, given this structure, which I agree with, given what it takes to deconstruct the self enough to not be, what's the word I want, sort of seduced by the lack project, given that the world is engaged in that on a very large scale and it is threatening our very future, how can we address that?
Yeah, thank you for that. We're just getting started in the sense that we'll be talking a lot more. In fact, after this morning, it'll all be much more about social engagement. But there's an important distinction, I think, to make, because as you can probably all see, social engagement can be also a lack project, for sure. It's like this, I'm going to save the world, right? I'm going to save the world. And so there's that, there can be that element. But talking about the Bodhisattva path, it doesn't have to be that way. You know, it's like we can approach it in a very sort of narcissistic fashion, but also it can be something that we naturally feel impelled to do insofar as we become less self-preoccupied. So that's a very important distinction, which doesn't imply, at least in my mind, that it's completely all one or the other. I think very often there can be a blend. And to me, what's distinctive about the Bodhisattva path, and we'll be going into this in much more detail, is that it really involves a double practice. We still continue to work on ourselves in terms of meditation or, you know, the kind of personal transformation involved there, you know, dealing with our sense of lack. At the same time, we know that that's insufficient, and that we also, maybe say it this way, that at the beginning, I think for most of us, certainly thinking about my own background, we come to Buddhism because there's some problem in our own lives, you know, whether we want to call it the lack project or something else, some sense of inadequacy. You know, our life isn't working as well as we want it to. And there's lots of ways to respond to that, but one of them is to get involved in something like Buddhist practice. But at the beginning, naturally, it's still a certain sort of self-referentiality, self-preoccupation, right? I'm suffering, and this path can help me resolve that. But as we practice more and more, what we realize is that preoccupation with the self is sort of at the core of the problem. That at a certain point, you know, that becomes less important or less fascinating to us. The self becomes more transparent, you could say. And then I think there's this kind of natural shift to being concerned, to being more concerned. Go ahead.
Just as a follow-up, actually what I meant was, I understand the process as a practitioner, but I'm thinking about the way that as humans we are caught in this, in these projects, which result in destruction of the environment and our own potential destruction. And it's at such a large scale, and right. I know as a practitioner of 40 years, what it's taken to loosen the grip even a little bit. So what's your prescription for humanity? How about that, David?
In 100 words or less? I can do it actually briefer than that. You ready? We'll be talking about that later.
Wise words from our teacher.
It's such an important question, but yeah, we'll be moving in that direction. Yeah.
Let's hear from someone online. Is there an online questioner? Okay, not yet. All right. Well, if online folks, feel free to raise that hand, and we'll be sure to work you in.
Okay, I was just sort of reflecting on, I have a sister-in-law who's Vietnamese, and my brother has sort of become involved with that family. And I get the sense that they don't have a focus so much on personal lack projects, but more of a family lack project. And obviously there are levels of, there are people who are very dedicated to their families. They are not putting themselves first. They are putting their families first, or their companies first, or their cities first, or whatever it be. And I just sort of, it seems like an awful lot of the original Dharma that I've been exposed to very much focuses on that individual, like I'm saving myself, or I'm finding pleasure for myself. And I haven't seen much talk about the Dharma meaning of, well, what if you're doing things destructive to protect your family or to make your family or your community successful? And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. No. I think that's a very important issue. One thing to keep in mind is the contrast between society in the Buddhist time and now, because at the time of the Buddha, of course, it was much more, what can we say, communal, collective, in the sense that extended families, people were part of extended families. And, the sense of self isn't always just individual, as you were implying, that it can be kind of a group sense of self, and I'll be talking more about that later on. But it's so interesting that because of the group family situation, so much of the Buddhist teaching was about more individuating, right? You leave your family, you go off into the sangha, and you're meditating, and the awakening is individual and so forth. So it was an attempt to free oneself from some of those expectations. And if you think about the attitude towards sexuality too, it's easy to misunderstand, I think, Buddhist teachings about sex because we take it out of context. I mean, in those days, you have sex, you're going to have babies, you're going to have responsibilities. It's like it's part of the whole social network. And in order to free oneself from that, one would need to become a celibate monastic. So, but contrast that, and then we come to America when we're, as I think I said, I think we're the most individualized society that's probably ever existed. Our problem isn't that we need to become free individuals. The problem is the other way, that we're too individualistic. And let's be honest, I think we're all starved for community and sangha. And that's why this kind of gathering is so wonderful. So I think that's a very important part of it. But replying specifically to what you were saying about the extended family, as you were saying or implying, the sense of lack can work collectively as well, in the sense that the family can understand its project about getting ahead and trying to cope and be successful. Although I do have to say, it's an interesting challenge. Some of the Tibetan people that I've met, fantastic, really fascinating people, and I don't see their sense of lack coming out at all in the same way. And so it's making me, how much what I presented, is it a universal? and how much does it specifically apply to the kind of society and the kind of people that we are? I mean, I think, frankly, I think it is universal, but I think it's a lot more of a problem for us than it would be for people in those kinds of societies. Yeah. Is that enough of an answer? Does that make sense?
I'm sure this will be covered
Yeah.
later.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my whole center this morning is that it's a beginning, and then we're going to be shifting into the social implications of this pretty quickly. Yeah. A couple more questions in the right side here.
Let's see, who had hands up? Alan?
Yeah, I arrived the second to arrive yesterday, and I was faced with the Taylor house there where it's very confusing. And my training is a geographer, and I'm used to maps. So nobody gave me a map of the, yeah, there was a map there, but I thought I can figure this out. I can just, analyze the rooms and so on. I should be able to do that as a geographer. And I wandered around and I couldn't do it. And what happened then is I thought I need to give this up and just wander. And at night I need to find out where the nearest bathroom is. So you let go, and then you can discover what the house has to teach you. And it has a lot to teach me, and I don't need to be a master of the house and knowing all the rooms and so on. I can just wander about and find eventually what is significant, where I can get my water bottle filled and whatever. So it's a marvelous experience letting the house teach you and get away from the self. That I have to analyze the house and have to figure out where everything is. I don't. I can wonder.
What's that great line from Tolkien? Not all who wander are lost. Yeah, but like you, I really enjoy getting lost sometimes, but with the expectation that I can get found when I really want to find my way. Yeah, that kind of freedom without the. In order to do that, it means that we're temporarily escaping this sort of ends means thing that we otherwise tend to get so much caught up in, which I'll be talking a bit more about later. Yeah, thank you.
You had mentioned that you didn't see that lack project quite as prevalently when you were in Tibet, but it may be more of a problem for us. Help me, what lens are you looking through when you say us? Is this a Western Eastern thing? Is this Eurocentric? Is this capitalist? How do you see that?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think I'm generalizing to include everyone, but specifically I see that as functioning in Western nations, especially in the United States. But I think that's a really important question to keep in mind. Ask how does it vary? Are some cultures, are they emphasizing it a lot more than others? Say, what are the differences between men and women? Sometimes, what's the role of families and reproduction? How much is that?
I mean, there are men and women everywhere, and there are families everywhere. Is it because the U.S. is so capitalist oriented? What's different here? Why is it that we struggle with this burden so much?
Oh, I see. Okay. That's a fascinating question to me because I've lived sort of most of my adult life outside the U.S. My wife is English. We lived many years in Singapore and 20 years in Japan and all that. So it does give a different kind of perspective. What I think is an important factor is if you look at our history and the fact that unlike, say, Europe, where you have this long cultural history as well as, political, so forth, it does provide a kind of cultural ballast or grounding in a way that I think somehow we never developed here in the same fashion. A few hundred years ago, people came here and they shot or chased away Indians, Native Americans, and it just never seemed to have that kind of more sort of organic foundation. And so I think from the very beginning we were more individualistic, trying to survive in the wilderness, or so we experienced that. And I think that plays out in a number of ways. I mean, as somebody who loves classical music, I mean, it's quite striking how much of that is European. And even though we've had a couple hundred years, I mean, you know, okay, we have jazz and pop, which is, and especially the jazz, I think, is a real contribution to sort of world culture. But do we have a culture, or do we have an entertainment industry? You know, that's sometimes I feel that difference very, very strongly. Again, things tend to be sucked up into the capitalist side of things. Yeah, I don't know if that helps at all. It's just a few considerations there. Yeah.
I think we have, I saw a hand pop up in the front. Good.
So, okay, so in particular, in some of the questions, some of this has connected certain threads. And as you were discussing the development of the LAC project, which is not the words I used, but recognizably similar to some of my own personal growth, and the question about the appearance in young children as how do we develop into all these issues, both the true sense of understanding that they develop to some degree, but the challenges that they also develop. And in fact, in some respects, the people in our culture, the American culture, that face what I might call, this, I'm just making this up right now, the lack issue, but for most people it's very different than it is for me, because it's used as an instrument of control by other people. And in fact, for them, it's unconscious even. They just see it as their ordinary way. We heard a discussion of Lewis Hines, the photographer that 100 years ago photographed child labor. He came to the manufacturers and said, "How would you like me to take a picture of your wonderful shiny factory?" And he was doing that in order to take pictures of the children. And the owners took it so ordinary that children were working their factory that they had no suspicion of his motives. And these became some of the iconic photos that galvanized eventually. So to those people, the marginalized in small ways, or some people in very big ways, which I don't think I have to list at the moment, although I could make a beginning list, they face the challenge of it's not just they've had a basically good life and they have these challenges. They're put in terrible positions that surely is far beyond my capability to have dealt with. So I hope everyone keeps that in their heart as well.
Thank you for that. You're pointing to another essential dimension, that the whole way that I talked is actually on the individual level so far, right? Again, we're going to have more to say. And what you're doing is, how does this fit into power, right, and control, and the way that our sense of lack can be manipulated by, consciously or unconsciously, by people and institutions, and that's an essential part of it. I mean, just focusing on consumerism for the moment, right? Well, guess what? Consumerism is an essential part of contemporary capitalism, and there's an awful lot of people who make a lot of money doing that. And by no coincidence, often this has a lot to do with the resistance to the kinds of social and ecological changes that are necessary today, because the reality is an awful lot of people, this system is working just great for them personally, and it's harder for them to see in the long run what a difference it makes for the future, and even for the future of their own. So again, we'll be moving more in that direction. For example, traditionally, Buddhism talks about the three fires or the three poisons, right? Greed, ill will, delusion. And I think, as I'll try to elaborate later, I think today we have institutionalized them in especially pernicious ways. I think our economic system, frankly, can be understood. If greed means you never have enough and you're preoccupied with more and more, I think that's a pretty good description of our economic system, and so forth. So you're sort of raising issues that we will be getting more into, but it's really important, yeah. So even though I talked on the individual level, there are enormous institutional and collective and national and ecological implications of what we've been talking about. Thank you for that. Please. Just a moment.
One moment. Let's get you the microphone. And encouraging our online participants to raise a hand if they have a question.
I'm noticing my impatience. I'm present right now at this moment to the billions of people around the world who are suffering, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's a result of tornadoes, many, many reasons. And I can't separate, and I don't want to separate my individual privilege and place in this world from that reality.
I think that's exactly right. I think that you're not the only person here who feels that we have to make that connection. And maybe I'm not being very clear about what I've done this morning. Basically, I'm trying to create a kind of foundation of understanding of Buddhist teaching, and then I think even with the next talk, we're going to immediately move into some of the social and ecological implications of that, which in fact we will be talking about for the rest of our time. So I don't mean to be ignoring or slighting that in any way, but I do think it's important to sort of get this grounding to sort of start ourselves off with.
I could be off base, but this is in response to you. I don't know how you could get away from it in the United States. We indoctrinate our children from ground zero to compete. I mean, other cultures, I can't recite which ones, but have childhood games that teach people to collaborate. We only have so many bananas. What should we do, you know? In America, every childhood game is about who wins, Monopoly, whatever. When they go to school, they compete for grades. When they play in sports, they're competing to win. Even at the college level, I see people on like rowing teams going down the river, and I'm thinking in my mind, the lesson is competition and belief in authority and reflexive obedience, and it's just everywhere. Then when you enter the workforce as an adult, once again, you're competing for that job, you're competing for that raise, you're competing. I don't see how you can get away from the lack project. It's everywhere, and especially when it starts at such a foundational age. Then it becomes like the fish doesn't notice the water, right? You know, you've been in it since the beginning, you can't get away from it. So I don't know if I'm twisting concepts around, but I think that might be related to your question.
Thank you for that. And it just makes sense insofar as we're more individualized, right? Yeah. And therefore our sense of lack is more individualized. And I think competition naturally follows from that preoccupation, sort of jockeying in relation to other people, you know, of wanting to feel better, wanting to have more than, wanting to be better, more famous, whatever, than the other person. I think that's just naturally sort of follows from that kind of individualism. Yeah.
This kind of goes to the question on child development and also that comment you made about Tibetan, and I'll just recount this briefly.
Could you hold up the mic to your...
I spent my life in child development. I was an elementary teacher, elementary science coordinator. In 1998, I was sent by the U.S. Embassy, where I was working, up to Dharamsala to the children's Tibetan village to work on curriculum. And I was with my wife, who's also an elementary teacher, teaching couple. We were there 3 days. And at the end of the 3 days, my wife said, "David, these people are different." Do you know what she meant? It's an orphanage. Maybe some have been there before, but they're instructed to get these children to become Buddhist Tibetans. That's their goal. There's about 1,000 of them there. So, and I worked there 12 years, and in and out with the embassy. And over that period of time, I became to understand what she meant. They're different. They don't view self like we do. And it was always a pleasure to be with them, work with them. But I think when you said, "I've met Tibetans," that I got a sense that I think you know too.
Yeah.
Maybe you could describe that, how it's like to be around somebody who doesn't have that, what he's talking about, that sense of self and self-driven selfishness.
I think you have spent a lot more time with Tibetans than I have, but I mean, one of the things I notice is this different sense of time. That's how, it's like they're more in place here and now. They're not so caught up in the fantasies of what they're going to get, what they're going to be like in the future. At least that's my sense. But then most of the Tibetans I've met are older. I haven't met many really young children there. Yeah. I guess my background really isn't extensive enough to have a clear, to say anything more definite than that. Yeah. But it's an important reflection. Yeah. I suppose I see Tibetans as one example of the much stronger sense of group belonging that throughout history most people have had, and how that can give a kind of support that it's hard for us today even to imagine because we're so individualized. So thank you for that. Yeah. Lots of, go for it.
Yeah, I'm aware of what I'm feeling and thinking as I listen to the whole discussion about individualism and how here in the United States children are raised, and what is it going to take for us to, move out of that. And I realize that, my thoughts around that is it's not just one thing. We all are subject to causes and conditions that in our lives will make us move in a lot of different directions. So yeah, I was raised here. I moved to Canada where there is a different kind of sensibility that's subtle, but people get it. Being exposed to the ideas of intentional community and being exposed to the Dharma and different ways of understanding the Dharma, having 2 Vietnamese daughters-in-law. So there's a lot of different things for each of us that I think can move us in the direction away from a sense of this fixed self and towards a greater understanding of oneness. And I think it has a lot more to do with connecting our heart than our head when it comes to this issue. So yeah, that's just what's going around right now.
Thank you. You know, there's also something wonderful about individualism. I mean, by definition, it's a kind of freedom, and sometimes that freedom can be really, really important if one knows how to use it, like in terms of following the Dharma, you know. The problem is for many people it's very uncomfortable, and they're not interested or they're not aware of those possibilities. But I think individualism can be a very important phenomenon in terms of liberating us to follow the path or whatever. So I haven't meant to imply that it's all negative, but it's a challenge. And you know, my sense is in society, the sense of isolation that can often go along with that is something that many or most people can't really cope with very well, and it leads to all kinds of problematic and sometimes self-destructive behavior. But there's a potential there. I guess that's what I'm trying to point to. Yeah. Profound courage.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, we have another question now that David's responded.
Oh, okay. So I have a confession to make, and I don't want to be too much of a downer, but I also want to open this up and say it in case I'm not the only one who's at this point. But when it comes to ecological destruction and all of that, I have this sense of the need to protect myself and not think about it and just hope that things don't go completely south while I'm still alive, so that I can, you know, enjoy my own personal life until it's time for me to go. And I think part of the reason why I came here was to try to figure out how to counteract that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'm sure, I guess I'm not the only one here, so thank you. That's very validating.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying, like, and I know that I have such, you know, incredible privilege that I don't have to worry about floods or famine at this point. And I'm mobile, and, you know, we can go wherever we want in order to potentially escape natural disasters and whatnot. But, like, I see it in myself, I observe in myself this incredible selfishness. How do I counteract that?
Self-protection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes, indeed. I mean, not only are you not the only one, but we may all be feeling that to some degree. I wouldn't be surprised. And one of the themes that we will be getting into shortly, I'm sorry to keep deferring here, but is this question, you know, how do we deal with eco-anxiety and grief in a way that both, you know, respects our own need to sustain ourselves, to heal ourselves, but also become engaged and do what we can. And I think in a way, what you're doing is pointing very nicely at the core of the problem. And I'm also wondering now, maybe it wasn't so wise for me to sort of start off talking this way, but that's definitely what we're gonna be moving into very quickly, that kind of concern, yeah.
We have an online question, Sam? Okay, let's hear it.
Janet, do you want to go? Oops.
I'm kind of, I've only been, I was, you know what, I'm gonna withdraw.
Hello? Can you hear me? I think we're having a problem being heard. The people online are having a problem being heard.
I can hear you, thanks. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
The people in the room? Okay.
Yep.
Sorry about the echo. I had a question about what you think the incredible amount of gun violence and anger we have in this country have to do with this lack, this sense of life, and how we might use our wisdom and compassion to address it.
Very, very good and very important issue, yes? Where, I mean, I already referred to my wife. She's disgusted. She's not sure she wants to live in this country much longer just because of the levels of gun violence and violence generally. And the question is, you know, where does that come from? I mean, we can, in a loose kind of way, connect it with sort of our extreme individualism, but I also think we can talk about it in terms of lack projects, in that the American dream, can we understand that as sort of, you know, especially a certain level of income, a middle class lifestyle? But if you are, if you don't have a college education, what are the chances, given the way the economy is developed, what are the chances that you're going to be able to afford that kind of lifestyle that you see everywhere on all the screens, that the American dream seems to promise you if you behave and do what you're supposed to do, and it doesn't seem possible. You can't afford a house, or you're having trouble paying rent and all that. I mean, I think there's an economic level of frustration that I think comes out often in a number of different ways politically. The MAGA movement, sometimes it comes out in terms of racism or anti-immigrant movement. And, you know, often these are people who have a lot of guns. So, I mean, I think one of the things that is driving us apart is the growing gap between rich and poor, which is already obscenely large and getting much worse, and the frustration on the part of of those who seem to be falling behind. And if that's the case, you're going to have to find some kind of explanation and way of understanding why your life isn't working out, and find somebody to blame. And there is this deep-rooted tendency to sort of find somebody else to blame, some class of people. And then you have the media that are often manipulating that in ways that, you know, I don't need to mention particular channels, do I? But certain people and certain channels are constantly telling people, yes, you're right to be angry, you should be angry, you know, because the people of color are taking over, or, you know, and there's a lot of things going on that inflame the anger. So if you have all of those social forces, and then you have the incredible number of guns that we have, it's almost inevitable to some degree that that's going to lead to a large level of gun violence. Or so it seems to me, yeah. Several other people want to comment here?
Yeah.
I can't help but comment on this one, and I would put it more, having been in very close contact with many of the school shootings now, it seems to me that they fall very easily into the lack project group. So many of them are caused by young folks who didn't get the positive attention that they hoped for, and had to respond to that. And for many, guns were just one way of doing that, of getting attention. Obviously, the groups that you're speaking of, the older groups that, incite gun violence in a different level, contribute to that by saying, yeah, this is a good way of doing that. This is a good way of moving through that lack to the attention that you deserve.
Thank you for that. That seems exactly right. And in the back.
Oh boy, now all these hands popping up all over. This is great.
I'm not sure how to use our time. Officially on the program, it's set until noon, which gives us half an hour. We can continue the discussion generally, but another option would be to break up into groups. What do you think? Might that? Okay, so maybe after this question, people can divide up into little groups and carry on the discussion as you like. Please.
I don't know if this is as much a question as it is a observation. After last evening's convocation, and particularly Deanie's presentation, when she was sharing her experiences at the Paradise Fire, and talking, she would pause and say witness, and then her experiences there. And one of her experiences was watching the animals running from the fire, and then watching the human beings running from the fire alongside of them. And when we went back to our room last night, that was one of the key takeaways. We were processing what happened last night, and that was a key takeaway for me. It just was such a graphic representation of the breaking the barrier between this delusion of self and the reality that we are part. We're not from the earth, we are of the earth. And I'll finish up here. This comment that was just made by, I'm not sure what your name is. Yes. And she was talking about protecting, self-protection. And I don't know how many of you have read, it's Finding the Mushroom at the End of the World by, can you find that for me, darling? I'm sorry, it kind of went blank. By Anna Lowenhaupt Singh. Anyone read this book? Highly recommend it. And her basic thesis is, we're already here. It's happening. We're running in the fire right now. And we pretend it's not happening, but we're in it right now, the full catastrophe. And just one last comment. We were processing this last night as well. Most of the folks on this planet who are being impacted, like right now, by climate change, et cetera, are people of color. Like Pacific Islanders, right? Go about maybe 5 miles in this way into Racine, where a lot of toxic chemicals are being deposited right here. And here we are in this kind of, this protected space. And I look around here, and I look at, for the most part, we're pretty, privileged in a sense. But that's an illusion, because it is happening to us. It really is occurring right here, right now, as we sit here. Yeah, so that's the observation I wanted to make.
Thank you. Yes. And I think it's wonderful to constantly be reminded of our position of privilege and never to take that for granted. But also to see that sometimes it gives us opportunities, to make a difference in a way that a lot of people don't have because they're just so preoccupied with trying to cope, I mean, when you were talking about people of color, I thought about that incredible heat wave in South Asia, was it last week or so? And then the last couple days, I'm hearing about these incredibly hot oceans, much warmer than ever before, and people don't understand it and don't know what it means yet, but we're in for it. It's just that because of our white privilege and our relative wealth, we've been able to sort of protect ourselves to a small degree so far, but that ain't gonna last, and it shouldn't last in the sense that we shouldn't ever become immune to what's happening. Yeah, thank you for that. Shall we maybe divide up into groups for, what do you think, 15 minutes or so? People just sort of chat informally about these kinds of issues? What do you think? It's 35 now. Leaving 10 minutes at the end, is that about right?
Pardon?
Did you want 10 minutes at the end?
Yeah. Well, not even 10, 5 for some announcements and then a little buffer before we need to
So maybe
go
20
over.
minutes for groups, yeah.
Okay. You have any recommendation on how large of a group you would like us to form?
I suggest quite small, 3 or 4.
Okay, all right, thank you.